This episode, Natalie and I interviewed Dr. Martha Sweezy, an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, program consultant at Cambridge Health Alliance, and psychotherapist in private practice. With over 18 years of experience in community mental health, she became a leading figure in internal family systems, IFS for short. She's co-authored several influential books and manuals on IFS, including works on couple therapy, addiction, and shame. So without further ado, here's our interview with Dr. Sweezy.
Hold up, one more thing. If you have not yet scheduled your 45-minute free exploration call to find out what the root cause of your symptoms are and your next steps to getting symptom free, you are going to want to pause this podcast and go do that right now. So I invite you to go to nutritionwithconfidence.com, book your free exploration call, and find out how to get your results and what is possible for you.
I thought we'd start off by asking you about what drew you to internal family systems. How'd you end up studying IFS?
Well, I worked at a community mental health hospital called the Cambridge Health Alliance for many years, and we had a pretty severe trauma population in the outpatient department, and um, and it was also a Harvard teaching hospital, so there were a lot of interesting things going on, and all the new latest kinds of treatment ideas would come through our department and great speakers and whatnot. And we had a behavioral medicine program that was terrific. And I was staff on a treatment team with trainees, but I would go over to this behavioral medicine program because they were into all the latest stuff and see what they were up to. And somebody there said, "Come on, there's this guy, Dick Schwartz, who's giving a talk in the basement of a church over on the edge of the Cambridge Common, and you should hear him." So we went over, and Dick showed a video and talked about what he was doing with it was about eating disordered kids that he was working with, and it blew my mind. And I had been through many sort of different trainings because I had the opportunity to just do that as somebody on staff. So I was the associate director of a DBT program at the outpatient department, and
And
I had
DBT is dialectical
dialectical
behavioral therapy.
behavioral therapy, Marshall Linehan, a treatment for borderline personality disorder and suicidal individuals. So, and I had learned EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and processing, and a bunch of other things along the way, because our population was so trauma based. It seemed that nothing was ever enough. So I was always interested in what was coming next. And what Dick was doing, I couldn't figure out what he was doing, to tell you the truth. But I watched him. I thought, whatever he's doing, I want to do that. I've been waiting for this one to come along. So I immediately signed up for a level 1 training, which they were then doing in Watertown, one town over from Cambridge. And then I went on to a level 2 training and a level 3, and I just kept going because it seemed to me it was a paradigm shift that helped make sense of everything I knew. And I knew a lot from working with patients over the years. You learn a lot from them. And it helped make sense of what was and wasn't working about the other treatment methods that I had used. So I was hooked.
Yeah. Could you speak more to that? What was and wasn't working that IFS helped make clear?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this: my training was what's called psychodynamic, which means it came out of the analytic tradition, and it's what's known as talk therapy now. But psychodynamic means conflict, that there's internal conflict, and once you have conflict, you have to have more than one party, right? And so Freud sort of amalgamated what we would call parts into three teams, id, ego, superego. And years later, Marshall Linehan had the same kind of tripartite mind model, which she called emotion mind, reasonable mind, and wise mind. Wise mind coming from Buddhism, a concept from Buddhism. So those tripartite models were all about balance and working it out, the conflict out between these areas of, whatever they were thinking to call them, thinking or feeling or whatever. But there was a kind of rule about you don't personify thoughts and feelings, then you're pathologizing people. So we were very discouraged from doing what Dick ended up doing because his clients taught him to do it. And yet there was another vein of thinking going on, where people were dealing with parts in a much more plural and less amalgamated way, with in some hypnosis methods, and I don't and voice dialogue, I think it's called. I haven't studied all these methods that came before IFS, but it wasn't an idea. It was an idea that was out there. Gestalt therapy, where people would sit in different chairs and speak from different parts of themselves, and so all that was dealing with a plural mind and how you make sense of internal conflict. But IFS has a very user-friendly way of talking about that. So it appeals both to clients, and it appealed a lot to me. The language is simple. It's not abstract. We're not asking people to deal with abstractions. If somebody comes in and says, I got drunk last night and I don't know why, I don't have to think up why. I don't have to come up with an interpretation about or a story about what happened to them. I just say, well, let's talk to the part of you who does know. Somebody decided to go have a drink. Let's talk to that part. And it's very simple, and it's appealing, and it works well.
I'm so curious if you could share how that integrated into your current like all the different modalities you were currently using at the time. How did you start to bring in IFS?
Well, that's a really good question, because as a student, and I was studying very hard when I got IFS because I really wanted to get it under my belt. I went through the trainings very quickly, and I started writing about it quickly because that's another way in which I make sense of things. Um, I I was confused. It's a lot. And one of the things I mean, I did DBT, which I had to, that was my job. I was running DBT groups, which are skills-based groups for folks who have a lot of emotion dysregulation and suicidality. But you meet individually also with the people who are in the groups. So the people I was meeting with individually, I would start talking about their parts. So we kind of switched from doing what behaviorists would call just a behavioral analysis, which has some similarities to certain features of IFS. So it was a transferable skill for me. I started interviewing parts the way I would just interview the person, and teaching people to think in terms of this psychic multiplicity as not being a pathology. The conflict is normal in the mind. It doesn't mean you're sick. And what you have to do is get in there and start relating to these parts rather than just looking at them and saying there's something wrong with them. So I did bring it into my DBT practice in the individual sessions, not in the group sessions. But other than that, and I did in the beginning try to integrate EMDR with IFS, which some people have done successfully. I didn't have that much luck with it, partly because I think the folks that I was working with had EMDR is very at the time, particularly, it's more developed now in the direction of chronic trauma, but at the time, it was more for single episode trauma that it was successful. And the folks I was working with didn't have single episode trauma. And so it didn't seem as efficient to me. And I think in IFS language, it was sort of jumping over protectors too fast. And I didn't know what I was doing. So I needed to kind of slow the whole thing down and just do IFS and just practice it, kind of from the beginning, going through the steps that I was learning and not try and mix in a lot of other things because I was making a mess of it and it wasn't good for my clients. So I learned that lesson, that I had to learn it step by step, and I had to introduce it to people in a kind of pure way so they could see what use they could make of it.
And you
Yeah.
talked about how helpful IFS was for you with just clarity of language and understanding the internal landscape and the conflicts that exist. Could you talk a bit about, you mentioned protective parts there. What are protective parts? And then maybe have you briefly talk about what are exiles.
Yeah, so the IFS model of mind is that there's kind of an infinity of parts, right? So we're not just dealing with three parts, and um, we're not uh, trying to name all the parts or anything. What we're doing is trying to figure out who needs attention right now. And when somebody comes in, they come to therapy because they're having some kind of problem in life and they want someone to help them out with it or help them think it through. Or they've been mandated to it because they're getting in trouble in some way. So somebody else wants them to go talk about it. But for whatever reason, they've come in because they have a problem. And we start where they are. Um, and then we what we discover in the beginning is that what we would call a manager part, which is a protective part, who's trying to keep the person on track in their life. Our manager parts are the parts who get us out of bed in the morning, get us to get breakfast, get to work, do those things, do all those responsibilities, take care of things, be functional, stay socially embedded, don't be outrageous, be socially acceptable and comply with group norms enough that you don't get kicked out, right? So our managers are very busy with that project, especially as we're adults, right? The kids, in theory, shouldn't have to have that much management. That should be something they gradually develop as a skill later on. Kids who are in dysfunctional families often have to have their young parts take on these management roles way too early and act like little adults. But in any case, once you're an adult, you need all this, and we're not trying to get rid of that in IFS. But those parts, um, when we also have these very loving, vulnerable, sweet, joyful, spontaneous little parts. You see that in kids, right? Those are the parts that just, fling themselves into somebody's arms or, you know, hug the dog, go play happily, right? There's all that capacity for joy and spontaneity and engagement in little kids. And those are the parts who get hurt most easily. And inevitably, life has challenges, right? It can be adults who are shaming them supposedly for their own good. No, don't stick that fork in the socket, in the light socket. You're going to get killed. How can you be so stupid, right? That can be a caring parent, but who says something harsh to the child. Can be an older sibling who is critical in order to keep the younger sibling in their place on a permanent basis throughout childhood. Can be other kids in school who bully each other, which is hard to avoid if you go to school. Can be teachers who are overly rigid and critical. can be, people in religious institutions. So there's all kinds of areas in which kids are at risk, right? And inevitably they get dinged. And temperament has a lot to do with how vulnerable they are to that, as well as the severity of the circumstances, of the child's circumstances. So, but everybody gets dinged, even if you have a perfect, lovely childhood and everything is handed to you in terms of safety. It's going to happen, right? So people then have these little parts who have been shamed, right? And depending on their vulnerability to accepting that verdict about them, there's something wrong with you, you're defective, you're too much, you're too little, you're stupid, you're not tall enough, your hair's the wrong color, whatever, your skin's the wrong color. There's all kinds of ways in which kids get hurt as they're growing up. And those little parts who absorb that and then come to the belief there is something wrong with me or I would not have been treated that way. And it's developmentally appropriate for little kids to be very self-centered, right? I am the cause of everything that happens in the world. So if someone's mean to me, I cause it. That's one way of trying to have some control over things you can't really control, but it also gets you in big trouble when there's something wrong with me, because that's a very toxic belief to have. It means I can't really be included. I shouldn't be seen. I'm going to be hurt again. There's something fundamentally flawed about me, and I don't have the legitimacy to exist in the way that other people do. And when that feeling occurs and that belief gets solidified inside a part, other parts sort of, who are sometimes the same age or barely older, take on a protective role. They're sort of hard, for some reason, they're a little hardier, these parts, and they become protectors. They get veered away from whatever their natural role would have been in the internal system, and they take on this role of trying to figure out how to stay safe. So manager parts get recruited into trying to improve or hide those parts who turn out to be a liability, right? Oh, that kid who cries all the time, we're going to put him in the closet and I'll never cry. No one's ever going to see me cry again, right?
Yeah.
So that is the protector's credo. That's never happening again. And managers they learn from their environment, and they seem to be their natural job is inhibition, right? To keep us on track. And so they're very good shamers, and they don't have any sense of irony about shaming in order to regulate shame, right? It's a big surprise to them. If you say, well, it doesn't really work to shame someone to get them to feel not ashamed, right? They go, oh, I never thought of that. So they're little kids, and they engage in this shaming, and it can get quite harsh, especially if the environment is dangerous, things aren't working well. And then in response to all their inhibitions and all their efforts to improve, along come these other parts who we call reactive protectors, who are trying to keep some balance in this internal system. And when the inhibitions and the criticisms become too much, those parts come in to provide some relief. And at their best, they're like, go for a bike ride, don't go to work, go right now and have some potato chips, watch some TV at the end of the day, because you don't need to think anymore. You don't need to worry about the world. So it's like mild, like, oh, it's not an addictive process. It's give me a break, right? But those parts, in response to the harsh inhibitory energy of managers, these reactive parts, who Dick Schwartz called firefighters, because they'll knock down the house to put out the emotional fire, come in, and they don't care about consequences. over the long run, they care about consequences right now. And the consequence they want is to put that emotional fire out, because the shaming that's coming over here is causing these vulnerable parts to feel even worse. They're feeling desperate, terrible, uh, just terrorized and in pain. And so the firefighter comes in and says, oh, we'll go to the bar. We'll just go get drunk. That works, and partly those parts are preventing the protector at the top of this hierarchy, which is suicide. So parts who look bad, who start drinking too much or taking drugs too much, or uh, you know, engaging in risky sex or pornography or gambling or kind of compulsive, impulsive behaviors that get people in big trouble and cause terrible long-term consequences. Those parts consider themselves the heroes of survival. And if unless we appreciate that, they're not gonna really trust us, right? Because people are constantly trying to stop those parts. Just stop what you're doing and everything would be okay. You have no idea. Things would not be okay. This person would be dead if I hadn't gone into the bar and had a drink that night, right? So there's a system going on in there with
Yeah.
a lot of subtleties and dangers that we don't know about unless we get curious about it. And that's what we do at IFS, which was the sort of brilliant thing for me, was how do I enter into this without being clunky and, making assumptions, but really find out what motivates these behaviors that are so destructive.
Yeah. Wow. I don't know if you mentioned the word exiles, but that's like what you were describing. I think you were describing the parts
The
that get
vulnerable
hidden.
parts. That's right.
Yeah, those
And
are
the
the
reason
vulnerable
they're called
parts.
exiles is because when managers are trying to improve or hide them, they're basically exiling the part from consciousness. They're saying, we really can't go on with all this misery and despair. Just shut up and get out of the way and get under that rock, because life has to go on. And we're not you. We're going to leave you behind, and we're going to go on and grow up, and we're going to forget about you. And that's what manager parts try to do. And firefighters too. They want that miserable little part who got them in trouble, who they're trying to protect, but who they also have some scorn for, who's weak and vulnerable and causes trouble. They want that part to shut up and just go away. And so there's this internal battle going on in which parts literally think that they can destroy each other. The managers get mad at firefighters and say, well, if we just got rid of that part, everything would be fine. And the firefighter's going, yeah, but if we just caused you to shut up, everything would be much better. And so there are these, what we call polarities, where protective parts are duking it out. And that's a lot of the conflict that people notice in their heads, these different voices saying very different things. And it feels chaotic, it feels crazy. And in IFS, we come along and we said, that's not crazy. They're having a fight for a reason. And they're not going to stop fighting until you can help that part who got hurt and show them that it's going to be okay. So there's another party to this internal system uh, that we're trying to bring into the picture, who's been kind of kicked out of the picture, which is what Dick Schwartz calls self with a capital S, um, to differentiate it from the kind of mundane uses of the word self. And this self is a lot like what Marshall Linehan borrowed from Buddhism, the wise mind. It's a concept in most esoteric religions. It's the idea that we have access to a kind of consciousness which is characterized by compassion and what he calls the 8 C's, a bunch of sort of centered, kind of powerful, kind qualities. And when we have access to that, we feel more powerful and we are more influential, with our parts because this is what they need internally. They need what he calls self-leadership.
Mhm.
They need somebody who's going to say to that little part who got hurt, hey, tell me what happened to you. If you're stuck somewhere in the past, I'll come get you out of there. You didn't deserve that. You are legitimate. I love you. You're lovable. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take you where you want to go. Do you want to come up to the present and live with me? And so we literally take parts out of places where they're stuck at the past, move them up into a relational environment in the present where they're going to feel safe and be able to return to being children because
Wow.
we have lots of different ages inside us. And there's nothing pathological about that. We kind of need all those different ages in order to make life as lively and interesting as it should be, right?
Right.
And so we're bringing that, all those resources of those open-hearted, loving, joyful young parts back into our lives. And you see people both becoming much calmer but also more capable of joy and less depressed and less anxious as they integrate these parts back into the present.
Hmm. And I can imagine that a lot of people, when they're like relating, I know I relate to a lot of these parts that you are mentioning and behaviors and the conflict, but sometimes it just feels like there's just one part of you that's just really in control and you can't like shake it or have
Right.
any kind of control over it. But can you describe that, what's going on there? And I think
Yeah.
it's,
Well, that's a really important point. This parts have the capacity to do what Dick called blending. He named it blending because of the way people described the experience and what he saw internally, which is that parts can sort of, if you think of it as you're seeing the world through the eyes of a part sometimes, and you see it completely that part's way. Like that's all you can see. You're pissed at somebody, and that's all you see. They did wrong. They are at fault. And you have the right to be angry with them. That's how that part feels. If that part unblends, separates from you a little bit, um, you suddenly see this person in a different light, right? You get that there's a part of you that has reason to be angry, and you need to resolve that with the angry part and possibly with the other person. But you don't see the person as all bad. You see that you see it more from a bird's eye view. They have parts too. They have reasons for doing what they're doing. This is something that needs to be worked out. They're not inhuman, or evil. They're just like you, right? And um, it's a shift in perspective and understanding that occurs when parts who have strong feelings either take over and they kind of share the stage all day. The stage is a really good metaphor for this because sometimes one part comes out into the spotlight. Like when you go to work, it's your work parts who are going to take over. They have certain capacities and they know how to do certain things. And they don't want that part who sits around eating potato chips and looking at TV at night to be, bugging you. They're going to do their thing. At the end of the day, those parts kind of recede into the wings and the part who is looking forward to going home and seeing your partner or your dog or your kids, whatever, comes out on stage. And that part begins to take over, and you're seeing the world more from that part's perspective. But if your parts don't, if a child grows up in a dangerous situation, dangerous enough where they don't have anybody really keeping them safe, um, so nobody around them is um, emoting self-energy in their direction. They're not getting that compassion, calm, courage, concern from adults. Then their protective parts take over. Like this is a dangerous situation. And actually, children in really dangerous situations can be punished for showing any of those qualities. You know, a courageous kid in a dangerous environment is likely to get slammed, right? A compassionate kid is likely to be, mocked, right? So those qualities get put away, and the protectors don't trust them. They think that just gets us in trouble, and it's certainly not, you know, we come along and say, no, that's great. Let's let that out of the bottle. Let's let that genie out of the bottle. And they think you're crazy. First of all, it couldn't stop what happened to us when we were young. And second of all, it just got us in trouble. So what do we want with that stuff? So there's some convincing in the beginning of the IFS process that there's some relationship building where we need to get parts to do this thing called unblending and meeting this other form of consciousness, the self, and seeing for themselves whether that feels like a good idea to let that back in and let that now adult resource become the leader for the internal system, so that these protective parts who have kind of run out of steam with the things they used to survive that are now just caused too much trouble, that they need some relief from those jobs, and that the self can actually take care of the parts they're trying to protect better than they can. So we're reordering. It's like you go into a family where the kids are running the show and you say, no, 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 there is a grown up here. And we can reorder this, but it's going to take a while for that little 10-year-old who's been running the house to say, okay, sure, go ahead, because that 10-year-old doesn't trust the grown-ups and doesn't trust you. And why should I go for this idea? No one's ever told me the truth before. So, that depending on how wary and a system is, how wary the protectors are, that's how long it takes for therapy to go. You can't say, you know, IFS takes 6 weeks or IFS takes 6 months. It really is very experience near for the individual and their protective system and the fragility of their exiles and how worried their protectors are about danger. So,
And yeah, I'd love to talk more about this unburdening process and blending process. But I wanted to transition to the topics of shame and guilt. You talked a
mhm.
bit about shame earlier. I know shame and guilt have been largely your focus. You've written a book on shame and guilt. Will you speak? I'm curious as what drew you to the topics of shame and
Mhm.
guilt in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great question. What drew me was that when my clients would get to exiles, when I got to my own exiles, what the bottom line was always, there's something wrong with me. I'm defective. I'm too much. I'm bad. I'm too little. I'm blah, 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 blah. All shame-based beliefs that were shame and identity based, in other words. And then I would say, well, how did you get that idea? And then the part would go to a specific experience or set of experiences over a number of years that were usually relational. In other words, it may not have been someone meaning to hurt the child, but or it may have been, so it's a range. But kids who are vulnerable pick up, and most kids are very vulnerable, right? They pick up these ideas about their value, their worth, their legitimacy, their lovability, and those beliefs then become their guiding system, their compass, and they're living around that. They're just constantly trying to manage this idea that I don't belong, I don't deserve, I have to hide this who I really am because no one will accept me or love me. And so the whole project of life becomes hiding this terrible truth that there's something fundamentally flawed about you. And most of us go through life, and that's our project. You know, it's terrible to say, but certainly my experience and the experience of most people I know. So you can be very functional with this belief, or you can be very dysfunctional. But it's still something that is a shame-based sort of operating system that's guiding the kind of choices you make, how close you can get to people, what your ambitions are, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so
So would you say that that shame and guilt are just feelings, or how do you describe or define
yeah.
these two?
Well, first, let me differentiate shame and guilt because that's one thing I talk about in my book that I think is really important.
Mhm.
Shame is uh, I believe I translate it into the language of action. In other words, if someone comes to me and says, I feel a lot of shame, I'll say, well, tell me what's happening inside you. And the person will say, well, either I hear this voice telling me that I'm stupid or whatever, or they'll say, well, I just feel like there's something wrong with me. And those are two different parts, right? The critic, the internal critic, which most people will cop to having, is the part who's saying shaming things. So that's one iteration of the verb, of shame as a verb, shaming. And the other is shameful, and this is the exile's state of being or condition. And that's the other, uh, iteration of the word shame as a verb. So I translate this in my mind, and I teach my clients to do it. Is it someone shaming or is it someone feeling shameful? Because we're going to do two different things depending on who we're talking to. If we're talking to someone who's doing the shaming, we're going to talk to them about why they're doing it, what they're worried would happen if they stopped doing it, and who they protect. And if we could help the part they're protecting, would they need to still do that? And the answer is inevitably no. I wouldn't need to do it, but you can't help that part. So then, you have to say, well, would you just hold off and let us try? I can prove it to you, but unless you're willing to experiment and be scientific about this, it's up to you. We don't control parts, but unless things could be much better, but unless you're willing to try, I can't show you. So we sort of coax these parts into a willingness, the shaming part, for example, into a willingness to dial it down some. And then we check with reactive parts, firefighters, and say, I hear you're watching TV all night, so she can't get up and go to work without being exhausted. If this one over here who's doing all the shaming dials it down, would you be willing to dial it down too? So you get an agreement between these polarized protectors, and then you get their permission to go to the part who has been exiled by them and is hurt and needs help. And you then witness that part's experiences and help it out, get it out of there, help it let go of those beliefs. So that's a kind of summary of the whole thing. That's when you get to those parts, those exiled parts, they're inevitably carrying what we call burdens, or which is beliefs and sort of shocked, stuck feeling states that have to do with their identity as uh, defective, right? And that's a shame-based experience. Now, guilt is a different kettle of fish. Guilt, shame is I am something, I am bad, I am defective. Guilt is I did wrong or I might do wrong. So guilt is about action and the potential for action, for hurting somebody else. So guilt is very concerned with relationships and with other people, and that's good. I don't see shame as being particularly useful. I mean, there are a lot of people who would argue that it is. I think it's been useful in an evolutionary sense, in that it causes people to comply with group norms. but it's not the best way to have that happen, because it happens at the expense of kicking some people out, right? The people who get shamed and exiled just externally and just like internally, they're the victims of this system that runs on shame. And it's not necessary to do that. So I don't hold with people who say we need to be able to feel ashamed. We already got too much of that, in my view. And it causes rage. It causes all kinds of acting out, causes a lot of polarities. It's just trouble. So guilt, on the other hand, is something that we do need. If you transgress, if I transgress, I need to be able to repair that. And we all transgress at times, right? And sometimes those transgressions are irreparable, and we still need to be able to find some way to try to repair it, even if we can't repair it with the person we hurt, right? Because it's an imperative that people have to become good again, right? If I behave badly, I have to have a way out of that, in order to view myself as lovable and worthwhile and someone who should live. And so guilt is an essential glue and repair, um, uh, sort of rope, right, for relationships. But there's also what is we would know as maladaptive guilt, right? Maladaptive guilt is guilt that isn't deserved. So the child who is parentified in a dysfunctional family, where the parent basically conveys to the kid, okay, you be the grown up and I'll be the child, and you're going to take care of me. And it happens sometimes in multiple generations, tends to go like a waterfall down generations, because the person who didn't get parented, who did all the parenting, needs parenting from the next generation. So it's this role reversal that just cascades. And that parentified child, is has feels guilty that and worried that they're not doing a good enough job, they're not caretaking well enough. Mom's going to kill herself if I do X, Y, or Z. I have to be really careful. I have to stay home. I can't follow my own interests or goals in life. I have to be a caretaker. Um, it's a loyalty, it's a concern, and it's an outward focus. So that kind of guilt is not, it's maladaptive, and we don't want to encourage it in therapy, right? It's survivor guilt and separation guilt. And those two kinds of guilt, we want to be able to spot and see the difference between that and shame. Shame is a very isolating, anti-relational state of being. Guilt is a very relational state of being. Make sense?
Yeah.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about maladaptive guilt. Because let me know if I'm tracking right. I'm hearing it's not necessarily shame. It's not that I am bad. There's something wrong with me. It's that with the example of a parentified child is it's I'm not doing enough for my parents. So it's not necessary. It still is different than
Or
shame, but
if I don't do enough, I am doing enough now, but if I stop, if I go off and do what I want to do and take care of myself, then I'll be abandoning them and I'll be bad and I'll be guilty and something bad will happen to them. So that it's either a warning system or it's an after the fact feeling of I've harmed somebody else, right?
interesting.
And kids, it's a real trap for kids in dysfunctional families. There's usually one kid at least who's quite capable and who gets picked by parents to be the grown up, and take care of the other siblings and take care of them. And that kid is in a dangerous position, and that can stall therapy because that person comes in, and it's kind of shame-based burdens and beliefs can certainly go slowly if the protected parts are wary of other people. But guilt-based burdens can be really sticky because it's sort of what we call syntonic. It feels like I'm a good person if I take care of my mother. So I'm not going to talk about this in therapy. If I talk about it as a problem, then I become a bad person because I want to go away and stop doing this thing that makes me a good person, right? And
Mm.
so you have to really sort of notice it and start exploring it in a non-blaming way. You don't want to blame the person that this young part is trying to protect. You want to say, well, you had a bad mom and you should just get over it. No, this part is very attached to that person and to taking care of that person's exiles. And so you want to validate that relationship and say, also, it's not going to work. It's not working. It never has worked. It's not working for the parent. It's not working for you. We can do this a better way. Right. So you want to be able to free that person.
It's so interesting hearing you talk about this guilt because I know it isn't shame, but it does kind of sound like the I am bad if I don't do this.
Well,
But
actually,
it,
that's exactly right. That there's a kind of for people who have maladaptive guilt, there's usually a linkage that goes to self-shaming, which is
okay.
I'm going to do wrong or I did wrong, so I am bad.
Okay.
Right.
So there can be, you can experience both.
Both, absolutely,
That's it.
absolutely.
And
Yeah,
yeah, that makes a lot
yeah,
of sense.
right.
Wow.
And unresolved guilt, if you did something, if you transgressed, if this is actually adaptive guilt, and you have a part that keeps you from addressing it and or admitting it, then you can also have parts that start to shame you internally. Well, you are a bad person,
Wow.
after all.
Mhm, mhm.
And Dr. Sweezer, I'm wondering if you could give us a case example, maybe a client or a colleague that you would have permission to share about your experiences as a therapist with them and how shame played a role in their system and their healing process.
Yeah, I mean, this is more an amalgam. I'll give you a kind of an amalgam of something that would be not unusual, right? Say somebody has a drinking problem and their spouse tells them, their partner says, you either I'm out or you go to therapy. And so the person comes into therapy under duress and they're ashamed. They have parts who are shaming them and they feel ashamed of their lack of control, and they feel out of control. It's not like I want to drink, it's I have no control over this. And but they also have a part who doesn't want to stop, who thinks it would be really a bad idea to stop drinking because, then that rageful part might come up and you might be dangerous to other people, and the suicide part might come up and you might be dangerous to yourself. So drinking is the least bad option here. So this person comes in with a lot of tension and a lot to lose and a big dilemma, right? And they don't really want to be in therapy because they're not, I mean, willingness is the bottom line of therapy. If the parts are not willing, then you're not going anywhere, right? And so you can't jump over that and say, let's act as if you are willing, because then you lose the client. You have to stay with the parts who are not willing and you have to spot them. So when someone comes in with a substance problem, particularly if they're mandated by somebody else, they're not willing yet. So let's say this person comes in, I'm going to say it's a guy, and he's not willing, but he's there. So he dragged himself in because he didn't want to lose his partner. But he's not willing to stop drinking. And he's not even there to talk about it. And what he is willing to do is blame everybody. He has a part who's willing to blame everybody else and say his spouse is being extreme. You're probably not going to help me, you therapist. So there's a lot of resistance to the idea that this could change. And with someone like that, I he's got a polarity inside because I know he's got a part of shaming him for this behavior. And that's partly why he doesn't really want to come into therapy because he feels so badly about himself and so hopeless about his out of control behavior. And he's also got a part who is determined to keep using to protect him. And underneath that, he's got these very fragile, hurt parts who feel terrible and are scared by all this behavior and feel they'll never be seen and they'll never get any relief and they'll never be helped. So he's in a tough spot. And when he comes in to see me, I don't want to take a side between the part who has brought him in and said, you have to do this or you're going to lose your partner. And you're weak and terrible and you need help and you need someone to control you. And we're going to get this therapist to try and control you because I can't. I don't want to take a side with that part because then I'll just alienate the drinking part. Right. And I also don't want to take a side with the drinking part. I don't want to say, well, this isn't such a big deal. Everyone's being uptight. Go ahead and drink. So I'm treading very carefully around this raging battle that's going on inside of him. And I'm more interested in highlighting that it is happening, that he has this polarity internally. And I used to use a whiteboard. I'm now online all the time and I don't use it anymore. But when I had an office, I would put it up on a whiteboard and I would say, so I hear that, there's one part that brought you in because of the threat of your partner leaving you. And what does that part say to you? And then I would get him to tell me what that part is, how mean that part's being to him. You're weak, you're stupid, you're out of control. And then I'd say, and then you have a part who drinks too, right? And it sounds like these two aren't on good terms, right? And what does the drinking part say to you? And then I would get all the drinking part's opinions about things. And then I would say, so how do you feel toward these two parts? Because I'm trying to get him to unblend from them. And it's really up to the parts to unblend. But if he can get a look at them, he can begin to have some interest and compassion for them, or maybe curiosity at least. And they feel that, and then they start to notice him. So this separation begins to take place.
So
And
with
as
that
this,
question, how do you feel towards these parts? It's an attempt to a- allow him to access that self energy that you're talking about, that
right,
curiosity, compassion, and get a
right.
little bit of space there.
And in the beginning, it could just be the barest little notice. The first thing I'm trying to do is get him to notice his parts and them to notice him. Because him being, not a part, the person in him who can have some compassion for them, who can understand why they're fighting, who could help that exiled part. That's a resource that's completely untapped in his system at this point. And so my goal is to get everybody noticing each other because it's all going on as if there's a hurricane happening, and everyone needs to slow down and listen to each other. And so I'll say to him, which of these parts needs your attention first? And he'll say, I don't know. So, well, ask them because I want him to start interacting with them. I don't want him to just look at them and get blended with another part who's critical or whatever. I want him to start getting curious and hearing from them and knowing that he's not in control of them. It's not his fault that they're engaged in this battle. It's not something he wants, but it's something that he can help with if he lets me guide him. So I'm trying to get him curious about this. I'm trying to introduce him to this different model of mind. You are not sick. This is not a pathology. There are reasons for these parts to be behaving this way. They are rational, but what they're doing is not working. And we can offer them something better that will work if they're willing to be curious about it. And it may take a while to get their attention and convince them to try something new. Right. So it's relationship building that I'm doing.
I want to kind of tie this example into what you were talking about with the different parts of shame or the two different
Mhm.
types of shame, I mean.
Mhm.
Is it possible, one, that someone could have both parts of shame, like a shaming part and an inner critic, and their exile feels that
Yeah,
shamefulness?
absolutely. Oh, yeah, all this
Yeah.
is going concurrently. I
Okay.
mean, if you do, it's really fun. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to do this, but you're in a group that's doing IFS and you do some psychodrama. You
Mm.
get people in the group to play your parts. You have everyone stand in front and you sign, you be my critic, you be my, drinking part, you be my little kid, and how should those parts be? What's their stance? What's their posture? What are they saying? And now have them do it the way it happens in your head. And then you watch this and it's all going, you can't even understand what's happening because they're all saying it at once. And there's this little part cringing underneath, and the other parts are yelling at each other. And it's very graphic, and you can say, well, no wonder you've been upset. No wonder
Yeah.
you can't sleep. No wonder you want to drink. I mean, this is not sustainable. This is a system in great distress that is trying to solve a problem and doesn't have the enough tools to solve it. And
Mm.
we can do better, you know. I'm going to show you, you've got other resources.
Yeah.
I'm
It's almost
curious.
like,
Oh, go
oh,
ahead.
it just sounds like a mediator, like the self, like this source divine energy that we're trying to
Mhm.
summon. It can be that mediator between all of the
Yeah.
noise and direct that, give some direction, right? So,
Yeah, and in the beginning, I am that, right? I bring myself and myself energy to the client's system. But as soon as the client self gets some traction in the internal system, they take over. And I'm more just, you know, offering some guidance now and then, or helping if a part jumps in and blinds.
yeah.
So,
I just love that about internal family systems. It's so empowering, you know.
right.
It's you're providing that support and those tools initially with that self energy, and as that energy emerges in the person who's consulting you, you kind of step out of the way and are just, less engaged in allowing them to engage in the
Yeah,
process themselves.
I'm just curious and compassionate and and often in awe of what the person is doing. And I like it because I'm lazy. I mean, truthfully, I don't like, burnout, working with trauma is a burnout scenario for a lot of therapists. And work is the operable word. I do not work. If my parts are working, I know I'm not that I'm being what we call parts led. That I have parts who are jumping in
Mm.
trying to get with some agenda, trying to get the client's parts to
Mm.
behave in a certain way, and I have to get them to relax back because that's not my job. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
So I think this is a principle that I've identified in the podcast so far is interesting. We're talking to Gabe Brown, who's really big in the regenerative agriculture space, and he
Mhm.
said, "I'm a lazy gardener." So I guess I guess kind
Exactly.
of stepping back in that case, letting nature, do its thing,
Exactly.
working with nature. In your case, working with the internal landscape and
Right.
letting that person heal as they have the ability
Yeah.
to. It's
Right.
that's
Working with
pretty
our
cool.
natural resources, which is it's
Mhm.
all right there.
That's
Right.
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
I was
You meant,
curious. Oh, go ahead, Natalie.
oh, well, you mentioned when you are kind of taking that step back more, that you're kind of just like a witness. Can you, I mean, you've also mentioned that there's kind of this witnessing of like the exile during like the unburdening process. Can you describe what that looks like more,
Mhm.
and why it's so important?
Yeah, once you get permission from these protective parts to go to the part who needs help, who's hurt, you your job is to invite that part. So let's say I get permission from this guy who's drinking to go to the part of him who these parts protect. And I say, who is that? Who do you protect? Well, I protect that 10-year-old boy who got so treated so harshly by his father. And is it okay if we help him? Yes, it's okay. So then I'll say, well, how do you feel toward him? Well, I feel a lot of compassion. I'd like to help him. And is he noticing you? Yes, he sees me. How does he respond to you? He's a little worried. He's not sure who I am. He wonders what I'm doing here. Nobody's been noticing him. So tell him who you are. What do you say to him? And then inside, the person, makes a connection with this exiled part. And then how does he respond when you tell him who you are? Well, he's coming closer to me, or he wants to sit next to me. And what does he want you to know about his experiences? And then the part starts to show or tell in whatever way it chooses, and it can be uh, kinesthetic, it can be verbal, it can be visual, it can be all of that. What happened that was scary with the father, and what did those experiences make him believe about himself? Well, it made him believe that there was something really wrong and defective about him. Okay, and how do you feel toward him? I love him. And so let him know. How does he respond to that? Well, he's brightening up. He's smiling. He really likes that. No one said that to him before. So what does he need from you? He needs me to stay right here. Or he's kind of stuck back in that situation with his father yelling at him, and he needs help with that. But I don't know how to help him. Well, actually, we can go get him, you know. So would he like you to come back into that time and do what he needed someone to do for him then? Yes, he would love that. So go ahead, and I'll come with you if you want. We'll go back into that time and have him tell you. He's going to be the director of this. Have him tell you what needs to happen. But before we do that, this is something I always add in. Let's invite his father's higher self to come in and take care of his father, because his father isn't going to be his responsibility anymore. Right? Even children who are being abused often feel responsible for and loyal to parents who are mean to them, but who are clearly in distress. So I want to make it clear that there's another resource to take care of that, the parent, and the kid is off the hook. And they can be angry, they can be mad, they don't ever have to see the parent again, or they maybe can have the parent make amends, and then whatever they want. So people have various different scenarios. They do it, you just let the part sort of wrap it up the way they want to. And then when enough has been witnessed, and it can be very quick or it can be over more than one session, when the part feels like you get it, I'm understood, what someone's validating my experience, no one's telling me I'm crazy, yes, it did happen, that was not right, I didn't deserve it, okay, I'm ready to get out of there. Okay, so you want to come to the present and live with me, or go to some fantasy place? Where do you want to go? So the part picks where it wants to go. Often they come to the present, but if the present is chaotic in any way, they might want to go to a fantasy place that's safer. So they get out of the past, and then what is that part ready to let go of what did he believe about himself because of that experience? Is he ready to let that go? Well, he was terrified and he believed he was bad. Okay, is he ready to let those things go? Yes. How would he like to let it go? He could use one of the elements, light, earth, air, water, fire, or he can come up with some other way that suits him. So, he wants to burn them, So, okay, let's have a big bonfire. Go ahead, you do that with them. Let me know when it's done. Okay, it's done. How does he feel now? Well, this is the usual answer. Well, he feels so much lighter. And how does he look? He looks happy. What does he need from you now? He just wants me to stay with him. He wants to hang out, or he wants to go bike riding or something. Okay, go ahead, do that. Let him know that we're gonna kind of come back here, but you can stay with him. There's plenty of you to go around. And you two are gonna stay in touch. And if he needs anything from you during the week, how is he gonna let you know? So you kind of establish that way of them being together and staying connected. And then the client comes back out of this kind of trance-like state that they've gone into automatically. And how do you feel? And you can usually see in someone the color comes back into their face. They're more relaxed in the chair. Their eyes are brighter. They look happier and just better. And if it worked, and they'll say that. And one of the things I'll say is, sometimes these burdens come back because we forgot something, or there's some part who has an agenda around this, or something happens in the outside world that scares the part. Don't worry about that. If it does, we'll figure out what needs to happen and we'll do it again. But hopefully, you'll have a good week and you two will just stay connected. So you leave the door open for it not to work ideally or perfectly, because it doesn't always. And you're optimistic, that's fine. That'll be fine.
Mhm. I love that you just said that about it's not like a one and done thing sometimes, and it
Right.
it is not a perfect. There's a lot of imperfections in life, right? And just
Right.
that's part of it.
Right.
Yeah, the lessons that we learn.
Yeah. I mean, as the therapist, your presentation as sort of relaxed, optimistic, what Dick calls a hope merchant, being a hope merchant, and having and bringing all the knowledge. It helps if you have more experience, because it's hard when you don't to have this faith. But as you get more experience, you have a lot of faith that it's going to work out. It's going to be fine. And you can convey that faith, which is very grounding for people who are having this enormous experience.
And with this unburdening process, I mean, it's so touching and powerful. You talking about uh, someone's adult self connecting with this little part of them that experienced some sort of trauma and being able to show compassion to that part, helping it release that extreme emotion and belief and go to a safe place. As you're going through this process with people, do people get to a place where they don't really need therapy anymore, or is it more of a lifelong thing for all of us that we always have to be engaging in
No,
this
no, I
process for
certainly
the
hope
rest of
people
our
get to the
lives?
point where they don't need therapy anymore. I mean, I like it when people graduate, basically. Mostly I'm available. I'll say, if you need to come back and talk about something, if something comes up, I'm right here. So I'm not, um, I'm not cutting the rope and saying you have to deal with loss and all that. I'm just like saying you don't need this every week anymore. So go do it on your own. If you need some backup, let me know. I'm right here. We can check out what's happening. And so for some people it's more gradual. For some people they're like, great, I'm good to go. I'm done. Um, and maybe I'll let you know what's happening. And some people just disappear, and some people stay in touch. But I want people to be able to go on. On the other hand, I don't want to push them out the door, because sometimes they have parts who have said as a preview, I know if I let her get better, then you're going to disappear and I'm going to lose you. And I'm like, that's a choice, your choice. You don't have to keep seeing me, but well, it may not be every week too. If someone's doing a lot better and they have a part who just wants to hang out with me, I'll say, well, let's do it every once a month or something.
Mm.
So I would kind of wean the person's system off doing something that they don't really need to spend the time and money doing anymore. But
Yeah.
And I think
yeah,
earlier you were talking about how you've uh, gone through some of these processes yourself personally, um, is it something that you continue to practice connecting with your managers, firefighters, exiles, or do you kind of get to a place where they just don't need much attention anymore?
Well, that's another great question. And basically IFS training is one big experiential therapy event. So I
Mm.
had a lot, I got a lot, I packed in a lot of therapy in the, say, 8 years or whatever that I was doing a lot of IFS trainings. Um, but in my view, in my experience, it's both a paradigm shift in terms of how I think about the world and how it makes sense of things in the world for me. But it's also a paradigm shift internally that is has been permanent. I mean, it means if something, upsets me, I'll look for the part who's upset and I'll look to help that part unblend and notice me so I can find out more from it about what's going on and I'm not being taken over. I have more information, then I can have more options and be more functional and effective about how I handle it, right? And that's being self-led. And I'm not perfect. I'm far from perfect at that. But the more, and there is no perfection, but the more you practice it, the more appealing it is to your parts, so that they're more willing to unblend pretty quickly because they're going to get their needs met, and they're not going to be bossed around, or some of them aren't going to be kicked out. And the credo of IFS is all parts are welcome, and you really have to practice that, or they don't trust you.
I want to share my own experience with like going back to the managers that inner critic kind of
Hmm.
manager. I definitely have recognized that part of myself.
Hmm.
And what you're talking about with like that compassion, I think it's really hard for me, or at the beginning, it was really hard for me to find a like really any compassion for that part.
Hmm.
And
So let
so
me let me just say
yeah,
in parts language,
yeah,
what's happening when you say that.
yeah,
It means other parts who do not like the critic were unwilling to give you any space to be there, because
right,
compassion is what you would do if you were there. And
right,
when you don't like it, it means there's a polarized part who won't give you any space, who really
right.
doesn't like the critic.
Yes,
Right.
yes. And so, and they're still
Right.
there. I can feel them
Right.
right now.
Right. So they're duking
And,
it out. Right. Yeah.
but I
Mhm.
wanted to share and then ask, well, share my own experience of how I found the compassion and getting to finally that space to get to know this inner critic. And I realized that they're just trying to, the reason why she was so critical is that it in her mind it hurts less if she's telling me these critical things rather than someone else. So
Right.
if she can beat
Mm.
If
someone
she could be
else,
preemptive
yeah,
about beating you into the ground,
exactly.
then you
Then
won't be as hurt when someone else does it to you.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
And so I think that's a
right.
cool example to share. But I'm curious
Mhm.
of why, if there's other reasons typically that you've heard other people's parts or managers shaming
Yeah,
themselves,
good question.
or their
Yeah,
other parts.
yeah, I mean, what you're saying is one. And there's if anyone knew this about that this part existed, then we would never be loved. We would never be included. We would be mocked. We would be belittled. We'd be in danger. So why would I reveal that? Why would I let you get close to anybody to see that? Why would we speak of that? We've done all this, made all this effort to keep that part out of mind and out of sight. And now you're coming along and saying, let it out of the bag, forget it.
Right.
So that's one thing a shaming part might say. You're talking about going against the grain of my job, and you better give me a really good reason and some good credentials for why that could possibly work. because it could be catastrophic if I were to allow this.
Yeah.
And so there's both preemptive, which is what you were talking about, preemptive shaming and after the fact shaming and, kind of sit on that part shaming, it's like that part pops up like a jack in the box and I have to really sit on the top so it doesn't pop up. I have to be really controlling and really inhibiting and really critical.
Mm.
Um, so basically you just
Mhm.
ask and then the part will tell you.
Yeah.
It's so great. You don't have to know these things.
Yeah.
Just just say, what's up? Why are you doing that?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think when I would ask this part, it would say like what it really wants is just to belong, right? So
Right.
that like you're saying, it's like this evolutionary way for us to not go against the grain and not be part of our tribe or somehow be
Exactly.
exiled from
Right.
connection with people. But in
Exactly.
it's so funny how these parts in their efforts to get what they really want, they often perpetuate a system that doesn't, so that they don't get what they actually are trying
And
to
it's
get.
not often, it's always,
Oh,
actually.
yes.
That there's the
Yeah.
irony
Always.
that protective parts who are so well intentioned and really trying so hard always get exactly the opposite of what they're trying to accomplish.
Mm.
And then they grow more and more frustrated and extreme because things are getting worse, not better. And
Mhm.
they're young and often developmentally not really so capable of getting the bird's eye view of that and understanding why it's not working and seeing other options. So they're
So,
So,
trapped. Yeah.
yeah. So supporting these shaming managers is really just as simple of asking them what they need,
It's
right?
befriending them. What we're doing with in the whole first portion of IFS before we get to the witnessing of exiles is
Mhm.
befriending protectors and reassuring them and listening to them and honoring their hard work. They really like that and acknowledging that they had valid motives at some point to do what they do, listening to how hard it's been for them to do their jobs, listening for critical parts, how hard it's been to be hated by all the other parts, because they're all heroes in their own way. They're sacrificing their fun, their play, their ability to be children. They're doing jobs that make other parts or other people hate them and want to kill them off. It's not easy being a protected part. And so we come in with a lot of praise and and comfort, for these parts and say, we're not trying to get rid of you. You're great. You did a great job, but wouldn't you like to have options now? Wouldn't you like to be able to go play? Um, well, try something new, and I'll tell you, I'll guide you. I'll show you what it is. You'll be surprised at how cool it is. Yeah.
and you may have
So,
just answered the question that I had of if someone's listening and this is really resonating for them and they're
mhm.
wanting some tips or tools of first steps. I'm hearing this befriending the managers
Mhm.
and firefighters. Are there any other for someone who's like just starting off in this journey and connecting with their internal world? Are there any other words of wisdom or tips that you have for people?
Yeah, get help.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, it depends. Some people can kind of convince their parts to notice them, but for a really traumatized system, having somebody to help the negotiation with these parts is really important because the parts don't, they literally, if you'll say to a protected part, how old do you think the client is? They'll say, he or she is 5 or he or she is 10 or 8 and they don't see anything except that part they're protecting and so if you try and talk to them they're like me, you know I'm not interested in you, I'm doing my job and I don't know who you are, right? So it takes a while to kind of coax them into trying something different.
Yeah.
Um,
And if folks are interested in connecting with a
Mhm.
therapist who's trained in internal family systems, where's a good place for them to start searching?
Well, the IFS Institute has a website online, and they have a listing of all the therapists who've been trained in IFS who want to be listed there, along with whether they're certified and what level of training they've gone through and where they're located and whether they're taking clients and whether they take insurance and all that kind of stuff. So that's a good place to go. And if someone's interested in couple therapy, they should go to the Intimacy from the Inside Out, or IFIO website, which is Tony Herbine blank, Herbine dash blank, who teaches couple therapy at at the IFS Institute and has her own program and a listing of the folks who have been trained by her. And that's terrific too. So
um, Thank you so
mm,
much. Is there
you're
anything
welcome.
else that you would love to share that we missed in talking about, something from your book or
Well, I mean, we had a pretty thorough conversation. I would just say that in my view, shame and guilt are the heart of the matter for a lot of dysfunctional behavior, including most addictive processes. And I mean, not that terror and whatnot aren't important players and anger, but at the heart of it often is this um, is the sense of I'm not lovable, I'm not valuable, I'm not worthwhile, I don't have no reason to exist, and that's a pretty devastating thought. So that tends to be like the furnace that that fuels all this uh, activity to hide that information. And so I have taken a look in my book at which is called Internal Family Systems for Shame and Guilt, at how to look at these two very important um, sort of active feelings, influential feelings, um, from the perspective of a plural mind and how to intervene with them effectively from that perspective, which is, I always knew that from clients years before I learned IFS that shame and guilt were incredibly important. That was one of the first things I got interested in 1987 or whenever I started in the field. That was the things that interested me most, but I couldn't make full sense of it until I got this model of mind and understood about the internal relationships that were going on, the shaming and the shamefulness. So look for it. Look for it. If you're a therapist, look for it. If you're a client, or if you're just not even in therapy and you just
Mhm.
want to understand what's going on in you, this is the bottom line, basically.
I am a nutritionist and I work with a lot of people with autoimmune disease. And there
Mhm.
is that connection with adverse childhood experiences, development
Right.
of autoimmune conditions. And I think what you just said there is at the root of so much of our body's reactions and
Right.
physical decline too, with like the shame of like that feeling that something's wrong with us.
Right.
And the immune
Right.
system almost like reversing and attacking yourself.
It's the
Um,
same thing.
yeah.
Shaming yourself is attacking yourself,
Hmm.
and the immune system follows suit, right?
Yeah.
Gets dysregulated and engages in self-attack. Yeah.
Mhm.
And Dr.
Um,
Sweezy, you mentioned your book, Internal Family Systems Therapy for Shame and Guilt. That's a great resource for folks who are interested in learning more. If folks are interested in continuing to learn more about your work, where are some other places to direct them?
Well, they can go to my website. I have a whole bunch of books, actually some that I've co-authored with other people on various topics like addictions and couple therapy and trauma and so my website has some resources, and IFSI has a bookstore. IFS Institute, their website has a bookstore, and they have a lot of videos. YouTube has videos, I think, of Dick and Schwartz and other people who are lead trainers, showing how IFS works. Um, and there are also sometimes if you're not a therapist, but you want to get some experience of this from uh, in a group, there are resources like sometimes Dick or Tony do weekends with couples who want to work on their relationships. So you can just look for things like that online, find out who the lead trainers are and see what they're offering. Also, C. Sykes, who specializes in addictions, teaches at various uh, addiction recovery centers like the Meadows. And I think she has a website where you can go and see the places where she's been sort of bringing the model so that they use it for addictions treatment. Okay.
Well, Dr.
Yeah,
Sweezy, thanks so much for the
you're
time
welcome.
today.
Thank you.
And thanks for all you're doing in the world. It's,
Mhm.
talking about that self energy. I experienced that from you in our conversation, and it is so disarming, and it's so appreciate it. Appreciate it.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank
Thank
you.
you
I
so much.
appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.